The shot that crippled him was a sound he never forgot. It wasn't the bang that stayed with him. It was the silence after. The dead, cold silence of his own kin turning their backs, leaving him in the dust with a shattered leg and a name nobody dared to speak again. For years, that silence was his only neighbor. Him, a busted-up cabin, and a fire that never quite burned away the chill. He was a ghost in his own life. A man with half a leg who the world decided was no man at all. Tonight, the world was angry. A storm was tearing across the plains, hammering his little shack like it wanted to rip him right out of his lonely existence. He listened to the thunder and heard the judgment he'd been living with for a decade. The world had forgotten him, and that was just fine. But then he heard it. Another sound. Not thunder. Not the wind. Hoofbeats. Desperate. Wrong. The rhythm was all off, a panicked scramble against the mud. He pulled himself up, his good leg taking the strain, his cane finding its familiar place in his hand. He limped to the rain-streaked window, squinting into the chaos. What he saw didn't make sense. A single horse, its head low, steam blasting from its nostrils, carrying 3 people. A woman, her face a pale mask in the lightning, and 2 small children clinging to her like burrs. The horse stumbled, went to its knees, and didn't get up. It collapsed right at his door. A moment later, a knock came. Not a polite knock. A fist against the wood, a sound that said, "I have nowhere else to go." He opened the door, and the storm blew in with her. She was soaked, terrified, but her eyes were like burning coals. She said her name was Alara, that she was Apache, cast out by her people for breaking their law. She begged for shelter, not for herself, she said, but for the kids. He looked at her, then at the 2 little girls shivering in her shadow, and the bitterness rose up in him like bile. The world hadn't opened a door for him, not one. His own brothers had ridden away. Why should he open his? But then he saw their faces, their huge dark eyes reflecting his fire, and a memory hit him, his own mother, a lifetime ago, telling him no darkness lasts forever. He stepped aside. He let them in, and with them he let in a world of trouble he couldn't possibly imagine. He thought he was giving shelter to an outcast. He was wrong. He was opening his door to a secret that would get them all killed. Inside, the warmth of the fire seemed to make them shiver even harder. The woman, Ilara, slid her daughters off her back. They were tiny, maybe 5 and 6 years old, their faces streaked with mud and tears. They didn't make a sound, just stared at him with an unnerving stillness. He pointed to the hearth. "Get warm." The words felt foreign in his throat, rusty from disuse. She nodded, her thanks a silent gesture as she peeled the wet blankets off the girls. He turned away, giving them a sliver of privacy, and threw another log on the fire. Sparks flew up the chimney like angry prayers. He could feel her eyes on his back, on the awkward way he moved, on the cane that was practically part of his arm. He hated it. He hated the pity he knew was coming. But when he turned back, there was no pity in her eyes. There was something else. A hard, calculating watchfulness. She wasn't just a desperate mother. She was a survivor, and her eyes were scanning his cabin, taking in the single cot, the sparse shelves, the rifle mounted over the fireplace. She wasn't just looking for safety, she was measuring him. He didn't like it one bit. The days that followed were a tense truce. The storm passed, leaving the world washed clean, but the air inside the cabin remained thick with unspoken things. Ilara was a quiet presence. She worked from dawn till dusk, mending his clothes with thread she unraveled from her own worn cloak, finding edible roots in the woods he'd never bothered to look for. She was earning her keep, and then some. She never asked for a thing. The little girls, Leah and Maya, were different. They were quiet at first, like little mice. But slowly, their curiosity won out. They'd watch him as he cleaned his rifle, their heads tilted. They'd follow him when he checked his traps, their small feet barely making a sound. One afternoon, the younger one, Maya, pointed at his leg. "Does it hurt?" she asked, her voice clear as a bell. He grunted. "Always." She just nodded, as if this were the most normal answer in the world. Then she reached out a tiny hand and patted the worn leather brace he wore. It wasn't a gesture of pity. It was a gesture of understanding. It unsettled him more than any storm. That night, something felt wrong. He was dozing by the fire when a floorboard creaked. His eyes snapped open. Alara was standing by the window, peering out into the moonless night. She was holding something in her hand, a small leather pouch. She thought he was asleep. He watched through slitted eyes as she opened the pouch and took something out. It was dark and heavy, not a trinket. It looked like a piece of carved stone, or maybe metal. She clutched it to her chest, her lips moving in a silent prayer, and her whole body was rigid with fear. She wasn't just hiding from her past. She was hiding from something that was still out there, hunting her. And now, it was hunting him too. He decided to wait, to watch. He was a patient man. The wilderness had taught him that. He pretended to see nothing. He went about his days, teaching the girls how to set a snare, showing Alara which streams held fish. A strange rhythm settled over the cabin. It wasn't peace. It was the calm before the battle. He started noticing small things. The way Alara would flinch at the sound of a horse in the far distance. The way she taught her daughters to hide at a single sharp whistle. They weren't just games. They were drills. She was training them for a fight. One evening, he was cleaning a rabbit for their stew when Leah, the older girl, came to him. She was holding a small, crudely carved wooden bird. "Mama made it," she said. He took it. The work was rough, but the shape was perfect. "Your mother is a skilled woman." Leah looked up at him, her dark eyes serious. "She says we can't stay here forever. She says the shadow men will find us." The name sent a chill down his spine. It wasn't an Apache term he'd ever heard. It sounded like something else entirely. Shadow men? "They wear black," Leah whispered, leaning in close. "And they took our father." He froze, the knife still in his hand. Alara had never mentioned a husband. She had told him she was cast out for defying her tribe's law, a law that had nothing to do with a husband or men in black. Every word she had spoken to him on that first night was a lie, and the truth, he suspected, was far more dangerous. He looked from the child's earnest face to the woman by the fire, stirring their meal. She looked up and their eyes met across the small room. He saw the flicker of panic in her gaze. She knew she'd been caught. The quiet truce was over. The storm was back. And this time, it was inside the cabin walls. That night, after the children were asleep, he confronted her. He didn't raise his voice. He just placed the wooden bird on the table between them. "The shadow men," he said, his voice flat. "Who are they?" Alara flinched. The color drained from her face. She looked at the sleeping forms of her daughters, then back at him. The fear in her eyes was real, raw, and deep. "You don't want to know." "They're coming here," he stated. It wasn't a question. "Leah told me they took her father. You told me you were an outcast. One of you isn't telling the truth." She finally broke. Her shoulders slumped in defeat. "I was an outcast," she whispered, her voice trembling. "But not from a tribe. From them." She looked at him, her eyes pleading. "They aren't just men. They're a plague. They call themselves the Black Spur Company. They ride for a man named Silas Kane." The name hit him like a physical blow. Silas Kane. He hadn't heard that name in 10 years, but he'd never forgotten it. A rancher turned warlord who ran the most vicious gang of mercenaries and thugs this side of the territories. They didn't just raid towns. They erased them. They were the ones who had cornered his outfit all those years ago. They were the reason he had a crippled leg. "What do they want with you?" he asked, his voice now a low growl. The past wasn't dead. It had just walked through his door. Ilara took a shaky breath. "My husband. He was one of them. He was Kane's bookkeeper. He saw everything. The ledgers, the names, the bribes paid to lawmen and politicians." She reached into her dress and pulled out the leather pouch he'd seen her with. She emptied its contents onto the table. It wasn't a stone. It was a heavy, custom-made branding iron, the head shaped into a cruel-looking spur, and wrapped around the handle was a small, tightly rolled piece of oilcloth. "This is the Black Spur brand," she said, her voice barely audible. "And this," she carefully unrolled the cloth, "is the key to a ledger Silas keeps, a ledger that could bring him down. My husband stole it. He was trying to get us away, to take it to the marshals in the capital, but Kane's men caught him. Her voice broke. They made an example of him. I grabbed the girls and the key, and I ran." He stared at the brand, then at the coded markings on the oilcloth. This was no family squabble. This was a death warrant. He was harboring the one woman who could destroy the most powerful criminal in the territory, the man responsible for his own ruin. "Why here?" he asked, his mind reeling. "Of all the places to run, why to my door?" Her answer chilled him to the bone. "Because they would never look for me with a man they already left for dead." She knew who he was. She had known from the very beginning. She hadn't stumbled upon his cabin by accident. She had sought him out. He was part of her plan. He looked at this woman, this stranger who had lied to him, manipulated him, and brought a war to his doorstep. The old bitterness surged. He should throw her out. Let her face Kane's men alone. It wasn't his fight. But then he looked at the two little girls, sleeping soundly by the fire, their faces peaceful in the flickering light. They weren't part of any plan. They were just children, and the shadow men wouldn't care. He slowly reached out and pushed the branding iron back towards her. "Bar the door," he said, his voice rough. "They'll come at dawn." He wasn't the man he used to be. He was broken, forgotten. But as he took his rifle down from the wall, the cold, hard weight of it in his hands felt familiar. It felt right. Silas Kane had taken his leg and his life 10 years ago. Now he was coming back to finish the job, and the crippled cowboy was going to be waiting for them. Dawn broke, painting the sky in shades of blood and smoke. The world was quiet, too quiet. He stood by the window, rifle in hand, his bad leg throbbing with a dull, insistent ache. Ilara was behind him, a small hatchet clutched in her hands, her knuckles white. The girls were hidden in a small root cellar beneath the floorboards, instructed not to make a sound, no matter what they heard. He had spent the last few hours preparing. He wasn't a fool. His cabin wasn't a fortress, but he knew the land. Every rock, every gully, every twisted tree. He had placed his few traps in the narrow game trails leading up the ridge. They wouldn't stop an army, but they might slow them down, give him a warning. The warning came just after sunrise, the sharp, agonized scream of a horse followed by a string of curses. He saw them then, 3 riders picking their way carefully through the trees. A scouting party. They wore the black dusters of the Black Spur Company. Even from a distance he could feel their menace. They moved with the lazy confidence of predators who knew they had their prey cornered. They stopped at the edge of the clearing, just out of rifle range. One of them dismounted and examined the ground, pointing towards the cabin. They knew. They had tracked her here. "They're just looking," Ilara whispered, her voice tight with fear. "Maybe they'll think the trail went cold." He shook his head. "Men like that don't think. They just take." He raised his rifle, resting the heavy barrel on the windowsill. The sights settled on the chest of the lead rider. His finger tightened on the trigger. It had been years since he'd aimed at a man, but the feeling was as natural as breathing. But he didn't fire. Not yet. The first shot was everything. It told them what they were up against. He needed them to get closer, to underestimate him, to see the broken-down cabin and the lone figure and think it would be easy. One of the riders spurred his horse forward, trotting into the clearing. He had a length of rope in his hand. He was planning to drag them out. "Come on out, little lady," the man called, his voice slick with false confidence. "Silas just wants to talk." That was the moment. He squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked hard against his shoulder. The shot echoed across the valley, a sharp crack that broke the morning silence. The rider jerked in the saddle, a look of pure shock on his face, before tumbling to the ground. His horse shrieked and bolted. The other two riders scrambled for cover, diving from their saddles and firing blindly at the cabin. Bullets splintered the wood around the window, sending shards flying into the room. He ducked back, reloading with steady hands. The fight had begun. He was outnumbered, outgunned, and his body was a wreck. But as he peeked back over the sill and drew a bead on the second man, he felt something he hadn't felt in a decade. He wasn't a ghost anymore. He was alive. The firefight was short and brutal. He was one man against two, but he had the advantage of cover and surprise. He moved from the window to a small chink in the back wall, then to another, never giving them a clear target. He was patient, his shots measured. He made every bullet count. The second rider went down trying to flank the cabin, a clean shot through the shoulder. He screamed and crawled behind a rock, out of the fight. The third man was smarter. He stayed low, using the trees for cover, trying to work his way around to the blind side of the shack. But the cowboy knew his land. He knew the blind side was protected by a thicket of thorns that no man could get through quietly. He waited, listening. He heard the rustle, the muttered curse, as a thorn caught fabric. He fired straight into the sound. A yelp, then silence. He waited for a long time after that. The sun climbed higher in the sky. The wounded man behind the rock had stopped moaning. Nothing moved. "Is it over?" Alara whispered, her voice hoarse. "No," he said grimly. "This was just the greeting party. They know we're here now. And they know we'll fight." He limped to the door and peered out. The third man was dead. The second was bleeding out, his eyes wide with fear as he saw the cowboy approach. He knelt beside the dying man, pulling the black duster aside. On the man's belt was a brand, the same black spur mark from the iron Alara had. But there was something else, too. Tucked into his saddlebag was a folded piece of paper, a bounty poster. He unfolded it. It showed a drawing of Alara's face, crude but recognizable. Beneath it, the words read, "Wanted for theft and murder." And then below that, a second drawing. Two little girls, Leah and Maya. The bounty was for all three of them, dead or alive. But that wasn't the part that made his blood run cold. At the bottom of the poster, scrawled in a familiar hand, was the signature of the issuing authority, the name of the man who had put the price on their heads. It was his own brother, Jedediah. The same brother who had watched Silas Kane's men shoot him and then rode away without a backward glance. Jedediah wasn't just a member of the Black Spur Company, he was one of its leaders. This wasn't just a fight for survival, it was a family reunion, and it was going to be settled with blood. He didn't show Alara the poster. He tucked it into his pocket, the weight of it like a stone against his heart. She didn't need any more fear, she needed a protector. And right now, he was all she had. "What is it?" she asked, seeing the look on his face. "Jed is with them," he said, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. Her eyes widened in confusion. "Jed." "My brother." The look of horror that crossed her face was answer enough. She hadn't just brought Silas Kane's war to his door. She had brought his own family's betrayal back with it. The past he had tried to bury was now clawing its way out of the grave, and it was coming for all of them. "We have to run," she said, her voice frantic. "Now! before they come back. There's nowhere to run, he told her, his voice flat and hard. They'll have this valley sealed by nightfall. The only way out is through them. He looked around the small, battered cabin. It wasn't much, but it was his. It was the only place in the world that hadn't turned its back on him. We make our stand here. For the rest of the day they worked. He showed her how to load and fire the rifle, her hands shaking at first, but then growing steady. He took the pistols from the dead men and cleaned them, checking the ammunition. He barricaded the window with the heavy oak table, leaving just a small slit to fire through. He reinforced the door with everything he had. The girls remained in the cellar, silent. He could hear them whispering to each other sometimes, their small voices a heartbreaking counterpoint to the grim preparations above. Every so often, Ilara would lift the floorboard and speak to them in her low, soothing tongue, her face a mask of reassurance she clearly didn't feel. As dusk began to settle, a new sound reached them, not hoofbeats this time, a voice, amplified by the natural echo of the valley. "Caleb, I know you're in there, brother." It was Jedediah. His voice was just as he remembered it, strong, confident, and full of a casual cruelty that had always set his teeth on edge. He limped to the firing slit and looked out. On the ridge where the scouts had first appeared, a dozen riders sat on their horses, their forms silhouetted against the dying sun. The shadow men had arrived, and at their head, sitting taller than the rest, was his brother. "It doesn't have to be this way, Caleb," Jed shouted. "Silas is a reasonable man. Just send out the woman and the brats. He'll let you walk away. For old time's sake." He didn't answer. He just watched them, his hand tight on the rifle stock. Old time's sake. The irony was so bitter it almost made him laugh. The last time he'd seen his brother, Jed had been watching him bleed into the dirt. "Don't be a fool, Caleb!" Jed's voice grew sharper. "You can't win this. Look at you. You're a cripple in a shack. We're the Black Spur Company. We own this territory. We own everything in it." He still didn't answer. He just raised the rifle to his shoulder. "Fine," Jed screamed, his patience gone. "Have it your way. We'll burn you out. We'll tear that shack down board by board." The riders on the ridge let out a war cry and spurred their horses, charging down the slope towards the cabin. The ground began to shake with the thunder of their hooves. He took a deep breath. He glanced at Ilara, who stood ready with a loaded pistol, her face pale but resolute. He thought of the two little girls huddled in the dark beneath his feet. He had lost one family to betrayal. He would not lose another. He centered the rifle's sight on his brother's chest. "Let them come," he whispered. The assault was a storm of noise and chaos. Gunfire erupted from the charging riders, bullets peppering the cabin walls like angry hornets. The air filled with the smell of gunpowder and the shouts of angry men. He fired, reloaded, fired again. His movements were slow, deliberate. Each shot was a carefully chosen punctuation mark in the symphony of violence. A horse went down, screaming. A rider pitched from his saddle. He wasn't the wild fighter he had been in his youth. He was something more dangerous now. He was methodical. Jedediah and the main force held back, letting the first wave test his defenses. They circled the cabin, firing from all sides, looking for a weakness. Ilara stood at the back wall, firing the pistol through a chink in the logs whenever a rider got too close. Her hands were steady now. Her fear had burned away, leaving a cold, hard resolve in its place. One of the riders broke from the pack, a flaming torch in his hand. He galloped straight for the cabin, aiming to set the dry timber roof alight. "The roof!" Ilara cried. He swung the rifle around, tracking the rider. The man was a difficult target, bouncing in the saddle. He took a breath, held it, and squeezed the trigger just as the man drew his arm back to throw. The bullet took him high in the chest. He fell, the torch tumbling into the dirt a few feet from the wall. Two more men went down before the first wave pulled back, retreating to the ridge to regroup. The clearing fell silent again, littered with the bodies of men and horses. The cabin was riddled with bullet holes, but the walls had held. For now, He knew it was just a temporary reprieve. Jed was testing him, gauging his strength, his ammunition. The next attack would be different. It would be smarter. "How many bullets do we have left?" Alara asked, her voice tight. He counted. Not enough. Not nearly enough for a dozen men. As if on cue, Jed's voice echoed through the valley again, but this time it was different. It wasn't angry. It was mocking. "You always were stubborn, Caleb, but you're not getting out of this one. We've got all night." Then came a new sound. A heavy, rhythmic thudding. They were bringing something up the trail. Something big. He peered through the slit. 4 men were hauling a massive log, a makeshift battering ram. They were going to come straight through the door. His barricade wouldn't hold against that. They were trapped. "What do we do?" Alara asked, her eyes wide with desperation. He looked around the small room. His gaze fell on the fireplace, the embers still glowing. Then he looked at the 2 full flasks of lantern oil they had on the shelf. An idea sparked in his mind. A desperate, foolish, terrible idea. It was their only chance. "Get the girls out of the cellar," he said, his voice grim. "We're leaving." "Leaving? How?" He didn't answer. He just started stuffing rags into the mouths of the oil flasks. He handed one to her. "When I give the signal," he said, "you light this and throw it at the front of the cabin, as hard as you can. Aim for the spot where they'll be with the ram." He could see the dawning horror and understanding in her eyes. "You're going to burn it down." "It's just wood," he said, though the words felt like a lie. This cabin was the only home he'd had for 10 years. "Get the girls. Take them out the back, through the thorn thicket. There's a small game trail on the other side. It leads down to the creek. Follow it downstream. Don't stop. Don't look back." "What about you?" she asked, her voice breaking. He looked at her, at this woman who had brought chaos into his life, but who had also brought a reason to fight. He looked towards the cellar door, where 2 children were depending on him. "I'm going to create a diversion," he said. He gave her a hard, final look. "Go. Now." She hesitated for a second, then nodded, her eyes full of 1,000 things he didn't have time to understand. She lifted the floorboard and disappeared into the darkness. He could hear the men outside, getting closer, their grunts of effort mixing with their jeers. He could hear Jed shouting orders. He stood in the middle of his home, a flaming torch in one hand, the second oil flask in the other. He listened for the signal. A moment later, he heard a crash of glass from the front of the cabin, followed by a whoosh of flame and the surprised screams of men. That was Alara's part. Now it was his turn. He smashed the flask against the inside of the door, splashing oil everywhere. Then he touched the torch to the wood. The fire roared to life with an explosive hunger, devouring the dry timber. The heat was immense. He backed away, coughing as smoke filled the room. He turned and limped towards the back wall, towards a section of logs he had loosened earlier. It was his only way out. As he kicked the logs free and scrambled through the opening, the roof of his cabin began to collapse in a shower of sparks and flame. He was outside, in the night, his home burning behind him. But he wasn't running. Not yet. He could hear Jed screaming in rage and confusion. He could see the silhouettes of the black spur men, caught between the fire Alara had set and the inferno that was now the cabin. They were disorganized, panicked. This was his chance. He raised his rifle one last time. He wasn't aiming for his brother. Not yet. He was aiming for the man standing next to him, the man in the fine coat who had been directing the attack from the rear, the man whose face was illuminated by the fire. Silas Kane. Kane hadn't been waiting on the ridge. He'd been here the whole time watching. He fired. The bullet struck Kane in the arm. The man screamed, stumbling back. Jed immediately turned to his boss, forgetting all about the fight. That was the opening. The crippled cowboy didn't wait to see what happened next. He melted into the darkness, into the familiar shadows of the land he knew so well. He was hurt, exhausted, and now he was homeless. But Ilara and the girls were safe, and Silas Kane was bleeding. The hunt was not over. It had just been reversed. He was no longer the prey. He was the hunter, and he was coming for his brother. He tracked them through the night, his bad leg a fiery protest with every step. But he ignored the pain. The rage was a fuel that burned hotter. He moved like a ghost through the woods, circling the panicked remnants of the Black Spur gang. They were in disarray. The fire had thrown them. Kane's injury had rattled them. They were no longer a confident hunting party. They were a scattered pack of wolves who had lost their leader. Jed was trying to regain control, shouting orders that nobody was listening to. He found Ilara and the girls huddled by the creek, just where he'd told them to go. They were terrified, but unharmed. Relief washed over him, so potent it almost buckled his knees. "You came back," Ilara whispered, her eyes shining in the dim light. "I told you I would," he said. "But we can't stay here. They'll regroup by morning." He knew they couldn't outrun them, not with two small children and his bad leg. Their only hope was to be smarter, to use the terrain against them. He knew a place, a narrow canyon a few miles north, known locally as the Devil's Jaw. It was a natural bottleneck, a perfect place for an ambush, a perfect place to end this. "We have to split them up," he told Ilara. "Make them chase shadows." He explained the plan. It was risky. It depended on Jed's arrogance and his own knowledge of the land. Ilara listened, her face grim. "It will work," she said with a certainty that surprised him. "He will underestimate you. They all do." Before they left, she insisted on looking at his leg. The long day of fighting had taken its toll. The old wound had opened up, and it was bleeding sluggishly. She tore a strip from her dress and expertly bandaged it, her touch gentle but firm. "You are not the man they think you are, Caleb," she said softly, her eyes meeting his. "You are not broken." In that moment, looking at this fierce, resilient woman and the two children who now looked at him as their sole protector, he felt a truth he hadn't known in 10 years. She was right. The world had tried to break him. His own family had left him for dead, but he wasn't broken. He was forged. They moved out, a small, desperate family against a private army. They reached the Devil's Jaw just before dawn. The canyon was a deep scar in the earth, the walls sheer and impassable. The trail through it was barely wide enough for a horse to pass. "You take the girls," he told Ilara. "Get to the other side and keep going. Don't wait for me." "No," she said, shaking her head. "We finish this together." She handed him one of the pistols. "The girls will hide. I will fight with you." He saw the iron will in her eyes and knew it was useless to argue. He nodded. "Stay high. On the rocks above the trail. Don't show yourself until they're all inside." He found his own position, a small alcove in the rock face about halfway through the canyon. It gave him a clear line of sight down the entire passage. He settled in, resting his rifle on a rock, and waited. He didn't have to wait long. As the sun rose, he heard the sound of horses. Jed was leading them, his face a mask of fury. Silas Kane was not with them. He had likely gone back to lick his wounds. This was Jed's hunt now, his chance to prove himself. They rode into the canyon without hesitation. Jed was so consumed by his anger that he ignored the obvious danger of the place. He was focused on the tracks leading in, not the shadows on the walls around him. One by one, the 12 remaining riders followed him into the trap. When the last man was inside, he fired. The shot ricocheted off the canyon walls, sounding as loud as a cannon. The lead horse screamed and fell, blocking the path. The riders yelled in confusion, their horses panicking in the enclosed space. Then a second shot rang out, from above. Ilara. A rider clutched his chest and fell from the saddle. The canyon became a kill box. They were caught in a crossfire, with nowhere to run. He fired with cold precision, each shot finding a target. Ilara fired from her perch, her shots just as deadly. The black spur men, so fearsome in the open, were helpless in the narrow confines of the canyon. They fell, one after another, their shouts turning to screams of pain and terror. Soon, only one man was left on his horse. Jedediah. He sat amidst the carnage, his face pale with shock and disbelief. He stared at the bodies of his men, then looked up at the canyon walls, searching for the source of the attack. "Caleb!" he screamed, his voice raw with fury. "Show yourself, you coward!" He stepped out from his alcove onto the trail, his rifle held loosely at his side. He stood about 50 feet from his brother. "I'm right here, Jed," he said, his voice calm. Jed stared at him, at his crippled leg, at the hard, cold look in his eyes. The last time they had faced each other, Caleb had been the one on the ground, helpless. Now, the tables had turned completely. "You," Jed whispered, his voice shaking. "It was you." "It was always me," he said. "You just forgot to finish the job." Jed's face twisted with a decade of resentment and guilt. "It was your fault. You were always the favored one. You were going to take everything." He raised his pistol, his hand trembling. "Silas should have let me kill you then." "Go ahead," he said, not moving. "Try now." Jed screamed, a wordless cry of rage, and fired. The bullet went wide, chipping the rock beside his head. His own rifle came up smoothly. He didn't hesitate. He fired a single shot. Jedediah looked down at his chest, at the dark stain spreading across his shirt. He looked back up at his brother, his eyes wide with a final, shocking understanding. Then he swayed in the saddle and fell to the ground, his body joining the others he had led to their deaths. Silence fell over the devil's jaw. It was over. He limped over to his brother's body. He felt nothing. No satisfaction, no sorrow, just a vast, empty quiet. The silence he had lived with for 10 years had finally found its source, and now it was gone. Ilara climbed down from the rocks, the pistol still in her hand. The girls followed, their eyes wide as they took in the scene. They ran to him, clutching his legs, burying their faces against him. He put his hands on their heads, his touch awkward but gentle. "It's over," Ilara said, her voice soft. He looked at her, at the strength in her face. He looked at the 2 girls who had somehow, impossibly, claimed his heart. His cabin was a pile of ashes. His brother was dead. His past was a ghost. But for the first time in a very long time, he felt like he had a future. He picked up the small wooden bird that Leah had dropped. He turned it over in his rough hands. "No," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's just beginning." They left the canyon and didn't look back. They walked west towards the setting sun, a strange and broken little group. A crippled cowboy, a fugitive woman, and 2 orphan girls. They had nothing but the clothes on their backs, and a future they would have to build from scratch. But they had each other. In the eyes of the world, they were outcasts. But in their own eyes, they were a family forged in fire and blood, bound by a promise made in the dark. A family that had stood against the shadows and won. And as he walked, with a little girl's hand in each of his, he knew he was no longer a man with half a leg. He was whole. The story of the crippled cowboy and the fight at Devil's Jaw became a quiet legend in those parts, a tale whispered around campfires. Some say Silas Kane sent more men, but they never found a trace of the woman or the children. Others say Kane was eventually brought down by a ledger that mysteriously appeared on a federal marshal's desk, a ledger whose secrets ruined dozens of powerful men. And the cowboy? No one ever saw him again. It was as if he, the woman, and the 2 little girls simply vanished into the vastness of the land, seeking a place where their past couldn't find them. A place where a man could be judged not by the parts of him that were broken, but by the family he chose to protect. What do you think happened to them? Did they find their peace? Sometimes the greatest victories aren't the ones won with bullets, but the ones won by simply choosing to build a new life from the ashes of the old. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales from the shadows of the Old West.